thank you for joining us for a pre-concert lecture. The Maryland Symphony Orchestra is soon to be performing its second concert of our 2021 Reimagined concert series, with music of Jennifer Higdon, Anton Orenski, and Dmitri Shostakovich. Jennifer Higdon is one of the most prolific and certainly popular composers of our day. Her music is performed by major symphonies around the world, and almost more often than other composers. Her music is immediately accessible. It is dynamic. It is wonderfully thoughtful and certainly timely. We're going to be performing a movement from her Concerto for Orchestra, which was written in 2002 for the Philadelphia Orchestra. The second movement, entitled String, is a musical romp. She called it a scherzo. It does have a form that is akin to a traditional scherzo in a symphony, sort of like a rondo in a way too. The opening theme, which you hear, a conversation among the string sections done in pizzicato, recurs in a bowed version a couple times throughout the piece, returns. And in some ways we think of that as a kind of rondo form. It certainly is a dance. It has a compound meter, a triple meter to it. Traditionally that meter is used with dance music. There's a sense of forward movement with a contrasting trio moment of stillness. Even though the beat remains the same, the music seems to somehow come to not a stop, but just a repose before it picks up again and rushes to the end. It's very dynamic. It was written with the string sound of the Philadelphia Orchestra in mind. And I remember as a young violin student that I would sit with my friends and we would listen to recordings of different orchestras trying to identify which orchestra it was. And of course, whenever a recording by the Philadelphia Orchestra was played, we all immediately recognized it because of its absolutely unique string sound, lush, romantic, never a hair out of place, quite literally. And certainly, although this piece, I think, exploits the virtuosic qualities of string playing, you certainly can see how highly regarded the Philadelphia Orchestra was by Jennifer Higdon. Also on the program is a contrasting piece of music, strings in a very different way of presentation. Anton Orenski was a young contemporary of Tchaikovsky. He was born during our Civil War in the 1860s and grew up with the Russian classical tradition, the music. His teacher was Rimsky-Korsakov, and he admired the music of Tchaikovsky. Rimsky-Korsakov said of Orenski that, and I think in a condemning way, in a way that he was too reliant on the styles of Rimsky and Tchaikovsky, and perhaps followed a little too closely, and therefore didn't have a unique voice that sort of kept him separate from other composers and kept him from maybe achieving the highest rank. But because Orenski died early at the age of 44, and he didn't have a chance perhaps to defend himself from such condemnation from his teacher, in the years since, he has emerged as a composer of merit with symphonies and concertos and chamber music. We see that his outpouring of musical compositions was actually quite extensive, and perhaps because he died young, he was eclipsed by the young mavericks like Shostakovich and Prokofiev, and perhaps his music was set aside. It has been revived in recent years, and this piece, his variations on a theme by Tchaikovsky, has never disappeared from the repertoire, partly because, of course, it uses a song by Tchaikovsky, Roses and Thorns, which is based, the words of Tchaikovsky's song were actually written by an American poet from the Civil War times, Richard Stoddard. It tells the story of a young Jesus Christ who is in his garden as a young man, as a child rather, and growing roses. And it foretells his eventual crucifixion, using the thorns as an image, thorns of the roses as an image. It's a stunning piece of music by Tchaikovsky. It is one of Tchaikovsky's favorite compositions, and it has found great favor in choruses and solo singers through the years. It's not a surprise that Orenski used it as the theme of his beautiful set of 7 variations and a coda. It captures the moods of the song, the young, childish exuberance, but also the melancholy and the tragedy of of Jesus's future. And however, it is also a wonderful musical composition that exploits the beauty of string playing. And it is this tradition of Russian string playing that, of course, carried on through the years, through the playing of Heifetz and Milstein and so many others that absolutely shaped the sound of strings. We think of Rostropovich as a cellist as well. These are this is the great tradition that gave us string playing in the 20th century and well into the 21st century. And now we turn our discussion to Shostakovich's Concerto for Piano, Trumpet, and Strings. And I'm very pleased to be joined by our guest artists, Sara Davis Buechner and Nathan Clark, to continue a discussion about this fabulous piece of music. Sara, welcome back. It's great to have you back onto the Maryland Theater stage, joining the members of the string section of the orchestra and our distinguished principal trumpet, Nathan Clark, who will be the soloist in this concerto. We're very happy to have Nathan join us as well. I have lots of questions for you, Nathan, because I know you wear a lot of hats in your professional life. And I know, Sara, also, you have played this concerto a few times, at least, and it's a very extraordinary piece of music by a 24-year-old fellow who hasn't been, the thumb of the Soviet Union has not been pressed down on him yet. It's going to take a couple more years for Stalin to start to get worried by this young upstart. And so Shostakovich is really pushing the boundaries, I think, with this concerto, at least in terms of musical content and his choices.
Well, he comes from a kind of distinguished long line of such nefarious activity, if we want to call it that. I mean, he was of course an expert pianist, and he shares that kind of commonality with the Russian lineage. We think of Orenski and Scriabin, and of course Rachmaninoff, who was one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. These people were all very, very fine composers who all wrote their own piano concertos to play as kind of show-off vehicles. So this is whom Shostakovich was following when he wrote this piece, still a very young man. And the youth is everywhere in the piece, in the energy, the brio, the sassiness, even the very opening sort of pays homage to Prokofiev in a sense, because Prokofiev's first piano concerto starts with a sort of an upside-down dig at the Tchaikovsky piano concerto, and Shostakovich in turn starts his piano concerto with a dig at the Appassionata Sonata of Beethoven, which starts, and the Shostakovich, etc. So he's, sort of mocking history in a sense, but then he gives the pianist just so many virtuoso runs and chords and octaves to play, all at insane tempos. And it seems to be widely documented that Shostakovich himself was very fond of playing this piece as loud and as fast as possible. So, really, what can you say? I mean, all pianists who tackle this piece are confronted with these amazing metronome marks that adorn the score, and think, I'm going to have to practice for 20 years to get it to that speed, you know. But of course, it's the excess of youth, and underneath all of that excess, there's also a great deal of tenderness and great imagination as well. I mean, with the orchestration for the strings, and of course the brilliant trumpet part, which kind of has this kind of concerto grosso overtone to it. This is a piece. It's kind of like the kitchen sink. Just they threw everything into this thing, and you can see him just proudly taking it all around the country and playing it. It was a big smash hit for the young Dmitri Shostakovich.
I know that he played it for most of his life until he was unable to physically. And if you listen to his later recording, it was written in 1933, but the 1957 recording, the tempos have really mellowed a little bit. Very few of them actually correspond to what he wrote in the score originally. And also the version for two pianos is a very different experience as well, because the tempos are markedly different. At least.
Yeah, it's a bone of some contention. I mean, to look through the score and say, well, what's the real intent here? And of course, you know, I mean, I think audiences get some sense of, oh, well, there's a right way to do a piece. But music is a very malleable art form, and it grows and changes. And a piece of music takes on a kind of life of its own as well, quite away from the composer. I was thinking to tell you today about another composer whose name I'm not going to mention. Is a very well-known American composer whose piano concerto I was playing. And I went to his apartment to rehearse it for him several times. And every time I went to see him, he just wanted it louder and faster. And it was in his head was this amazing explosion of stuff. And if I'd actually succeeded in playing it as loud and as fast as he said he wanted it, he would have been furious. It just would have been utter cacophony. Of course, the composers always hear this thing, you know, in their head, but the reality is of acoustics and so forth. So even just before we started talking, you know, Nathan was talking about some of the tempos, and of course, I'm very well aware of what tempos sound really terrific for the trumpet. I mean, when the trumpet is played at the right speed and the right character, it's just fantastic, you know. And you don't want to push that. It's just got to be just right. Am I right about that, Nathan?
You are correct. And I was actually worried. I've worked a lot on this for orchestral auditions all over the country, and there are some of the parts that you hear them being played with orchestras that are, you know, markedly slower than what they're actually marked in the actual piece. And I pulled out the piece to actually start working on it for this performance, and the tempo marking for the very end of it with the half note equals 120 was just blowing my mind. I had to sit down and work on that for, you know, probably a couple of weeks to try to get my tongue to move fast enough and get that to be clear enough. And then the tempo markings that you sent were considerably easier for me to play. So I thank you for that. But it's such a treat to be able to play this piece, knowing that I've worked so hard on all of these excerpts for so many years. And it's a very rare piece to be able to play and perform live. So.
That's true. I mean, a lot of times the only way you get to know a work as an orchestral musician is through the opportunities for auditions, and partly because this is for strings. A lot of times when you program a piano concerto, you want the whole orchestra, because the piano is a massive instrument and projects well, and most of the repertoire involves full orchestra. And so this is a little bit outside the, you know, realm of programming. I don't think it comes up as often as, say, his second piano concerto or any of the other great works for piano. But what an opportunity now, Nathan, for you. And I know that, as I said, you wear many hats. You also are in the Marine Band, is that correct? Or in the, and you were in, when you won your audition, you were just coming into the Air Force Band, is that correct?
So I was in the Air Force Band for 18 years. I took an audition in, let's see, I guess it was 2000, and I won the audition for the Air Force Band at that point. I believe my first audition for the Maryland Symphony was for third trumpet, and I believe it was in like 2006, 2008 timeframe. I'm not exactly sure the timeframe. But then Scott Sabo was principal at that point, and Scott then left the group. And I believe I've been principal since 2011, I want to say. But I was, like I said, I was in the Air Force Band for 18 years, up until about 2 years ago. And I took an audition for the Marine Band and here in DC in the President's Zone, and was lucky enough to win the position there. And I've been in there for just over a year, going on about a year and a half. And it's a wonderful treat to be with such talented musicians. Right now, it's a weird time for all of us, as all of us know, to be able to perform. But still to be able to work with such amazing musicians is an incredible honor.
So you have that important duty, and thank you for your service in those institutions, both of those institutions. Definitely made better with your presence, no question. And also the fact that you take the time to come to out here to play with us. It's a joy to have you. It's a joy to have you with us. And now to offer an opportunity for you to be a soloist is, again, another thrill for us. So if you could talk a little bit about, because you said you've taken the orchestral auditions and played this excerpt, what's the difference between playing it for an orchestral audition and then playing it in real life? I guess we haven't quite gotten there yet. We have to start our rehearsals for that. But also playing in an orchestra is different than playing in a band. It just is. The repertoire is different, although certainly the musical discipline isn't that much difference. It's just different ensembles, different demands.
Different ensembles, different demands. For the Marine Band, and actually I can go back to the Air Force Band too. When I was in the Air Force Band, my job was primarily doing ceremonial work. I was in this group called Ceremonial Brass, and our job was to play funerals in Arlington Cemetery, or foreign head of state arrivals, or retirements, promotion ceremonies for generals at the Pentagon or wherever. We've done a couple of jobs at the White House for arrival ceremonies. And at the same time that the Marine Band has those duties as well, the Marine Band is different in that it is a pool of players that covers that mission, the ceremonial mission, as well as the concert mission and presenting a public face for the Marines who are serving all around the world. So from doing ceremonies in Arlington to foreign head of state arrivals to jobs at the White House now for the President's Own, be it honors or be it Christmas parties. We also do public concerts at the Capitol building, and I believe it's at the Sylvan Theater, which unfortunately this past year didn't actually happen because of COVID. So you have so many different hats even within the Marine Band that you have to carry or that you have to wear, one being a section player for some of the best trumpet players in the world, just sitting down and trying to match them or matching them and being able to play anything that is thrown in front of you, to being able to do the ceremonial mission outside in whether it be snowing or whether it be 105 degrees outside. So that variety of performing that we have to do creates a lot of demands on you as a performer, as a trumpet player, as a musician, to be able to be at your best all the time. Requires a lot of practice and a lot of flexibility to maintain everything that you need for the job. And then doing stuff on the outside, you mentioned driving up to Hagerstown to play for Maryland Symphony. It sometimes is really challenging to do both of those things because it depends on the schedule that you have to keep for the Marine Band or for the Air Force Band. When I was in the Air Force, it can be a very taxing schedule through those organizations, and then to do the orchestra on the top of it and have to maintain and keep your face fresh to try to do both of these things. It can be very challenging, and you have to make sure that you're in as best shape as you can be, and just try to balance your time in preparation, but then also making sure that you're kind of fresh for all the things that you have to do. So
wow. And then on top of that, you are a founder of the Berkeley Brass Ensemble, which is, again, I think outside your work in the military. Yeah. So and we got to see a little bit of that artistry and maybe some of the personnel from that group in our holiday concert this past December, where luckily we were able to bring together some of the members of our brass section and extras to present a program of repertoire again that we don't normally do, brass ensemble repertoire, and which of course is right up your alley.
It is.
Which you do
so
as
Barclay
well.
Brass,
So
Barclay Brass is an 11-piece ensemble started by one of my old coworkers and a trombone player from the Navy bands, Mr. Willie Clark as a tuba player and Mr. Dave Miller from the Navy band, trombone player. We got together several years ago, and we love listening to brass music, and one of our favorite ensembles was the German Brass, or is the German Brass. And that is a 10-piece ensemble. We decided to go with 11, but it is comprised of all military musicians from the DC area. I believe at this point, all the trumpet players are from the Marine bands, low brass, tuba and euphonium are from the Air Force. The horns vary, but I believe the two that we have on the page are from the Air Force as well. And then Navy band for all the trombone players, except for one who's prior Air Force. So it's just a pleasure. We had so many players in town that we could actually put a footprint for this group, because there are so many players in all of the different military bands who are such phenomenal musicians. And to be able to break out of those groups and to have our own creative spirit and do our own thing with this ensemble is just an amazing feeling, to be able to do something that most people don't really get to do there very often.
absolutely. Well, for the orchestra, it's an embarrassment of riches, because we take advantage of the fantastic personnel of this region in terms of those fantastic players we're able to bring into the orchestra. And you add so much. And now going back to the Shostakovich, because now you're the soloist with this piece that it is cheeky, it is sassy. It's also military. It has a lot of fanfares. So those should be pretty easy, I would say. Especially, but at the end, it's like a romp. It's like a horse race to the end in some ways, I would say.
The very end, when I read that tempo marking, I was completely blown away, because it's just moving. And like I said, I probably started working on that part in particular, just trying to speed my tongue up to be able to get it up to the tempo that's marked. Like, I was just working on that for like hours on every day, just trying to get everything to work up to that tempo. And then, Sarah, you sent out the tempo marks, and I was like, oh, goodness gracious.
Well, no,
I was grateful too.
Before I play, so be prepared. Okay.
I'm sorry.
I always drink a little coffee before I play.
Oh,
so,
okay.
We can move it along,
Okay. I'll try.
I don't know.
But there is a lot of like tongue-in-cheek stuff that the little interludes that I have that interspersed with the piano and stuff, and I'm really looking forward to playing it. Like I said, I've only worked on these for orchestral auditions, and at that point you don't have any music behind you, so you're basically just trying to show a panel what you can do. And I'm trying to have the music in the back of your mind so that you can play it with the stylistic approach that Shostakovich wanted. Whereas now you have the full orchestra and the piano there to help with that and to get your mind somewhat at ease. Like, it's still going to be a little bit of a tense moments because it is a soloistic part, but just to have that the music in the background or music there to be able to help solidify that style that he wanted will be great to have. So
yeah. I think the first movement is kind of military. The second movement is it's a beautiful song that you have. I mean, it's mournful or melancholy in some ways, and then of course you take off in the last movement, the fourth movement. But it was originally thought of as a trumpet concerto for the trumpet player of the Leningrad Philharmonic, who must have been quite a distinguished person. And then he added piano, and then it became a piano concerto with trumpet. So I think because he decided he was having so much fun composing, he wanted to make a vehicle for himself. I think Shostakovich was, as Sarah, you've mentioned, he was a remarkable pianist himself. And I think I think because he lost a competition, he basically moved to composition as opposed to being a concert pianist. I think he went to some famous competition and didn't place, and literally turned not his back on performance, but focused then, used that loss, whatever you want to call it, as a clarion bell to composition, and how lucky we are.
I think it was the Rubinstein Prize, and he certainly wasn't the only.
It was a big one.
There were several distinguished composers who entered that. It was kind of a melange. I think Anton Rubinstein, who founded the thing, sort of crossed those barriers of pianist and composer. But I believe that several. I think Busoni entered that competition, if I'm not mistaken. But I certainly think that if Shostakovich, even if he'd won that competition and gone on to play a lot of concerts, he would have emerged as a composer at some point, because his voice is just too individual and too strong, And he certainly, he shows in this concerto that he was very full of the swagger that Prokofiev was churning out. And it's ironic in the sense also, I mean, all that trumpet writing is extremely military, as you say, but it goes back and forth between a kind of a satirical kind of sense and then a very patriotic kind of thing. And it puts you, it takes you out of the here and now, really puts you in the sort of a heart and mind frame of a young person at that volatile time in Russian history, when everything is upside down. And I think Russians at the time did not, couldn't possibly foresee some of the terrible years that were about to come under Stalin, in terms of this forced collectivization, I think they called it, and so forth. I mean, there was a kind of excitement in the air, I think, about what the revolution had brought and what the future was going to hold, and that excitement is all throughout this piece,
Absolutely.
As you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, the terrible years that Shostakovich was to have, the suffering under Stalin's regime, were all ahead of him.
Just a few years later, but yeah, he's still a golden boy right now.
Oh, yes.
And and he is the pride of the Soviet Union in terms of composition. He was really riding high at this moment. One of the things that makes him so interesting is, in our program, we're doing the Orenski, Tchaikovsky variations, and there's of course a certain reverence that Orenski has toward Shostakovich. There's not so much the reverence. There's acknowledgement of greatness, certainly of Beethoven. I often think of Shostakovich as very much, I shouldn't say the 20th century Beethoven, but the revolutionary part of it, the idea of really pushing boundaries and using materials from Higdon and Mozart, but making it his own. And Shostakovich certainly does that. And of course, he's also acknowledging, as you say, Rachmaninoff and some other people, Prokofiev, you mentioned, certainly some Stravinsky, and lots of Mahler in in one of the slow sections that the orchestra has. You almost think you have entered into one of Mahler's adagios, which harkens back to Beethoven's great adagios. So there is reverence, or at least acknowledgement of tradition in this piece. But it's also, there's parody of it, as you said. A lot of, I don't know if he's blowing raspberries, but he's just saying, yeah, okay, but how about this direction? Or, yeah, well, I've been there, done that. Let's move on. Also, the fact that he made his living in the 20s, at least as a teenager, he really supported his family through playing for film, playing in the theater for silent film. This reminds me of a piece that we did recently by Florence Price, her first symphony, which of course is very reverent toward the Dvorak great New World Symphony, in fact, in conversation with that great piece. But she also played for silent film theater, and she played in her church. So you have her reflecting on those aspects in her life, and the sounds of the dance hall. And so, that's from maybe the 40s or so, but Shostakovich already doing this in the 30s and using the sounds of his world, mixing it up with tradition, And it comes out Shostakovich, that's for sure. I mean, you can't mistake this for anyone else, certainly. But I also think that some of the tempos, you wonder about some of the tempos because there's a lot of lyrical writing, especially for the cellos and the violas, that if you don't give it some time, it becomes mush, becomes chaotic in a way that I know that he wanted to go as fast and as loud as possible, but there's times when the poet Shostakovich, the young man, the very sensitive young man, sneaks in there. And it is kind of fun to maybe take some time, especially for the orchestra. I know that both of you are discussing the soloistic tempos, the virtuosity of this piece. It's also a virtuosic romp for the orchestra. They never stop playing, except for a few cadenzas, of course. But when they do, boy, it's crazy town if you don't if you don't give some air to some of the phrasing, some of the beautiful moments. So it's a real challenge, this piece. And I have to say, early on in my study of it, it wasn't my favorite of his works, because I'm much more attuned to his great symphonies and later works. But I love his first symphony. I think it's a miracle. So I'm not surprised that a 24-year-old, I mean, he was 19 when he wrote his first symphony. So at 24, he's bringing more of his success. He's already written a couple operas and some stage work, some film music. He's already an accomplished composer by 24, far beyond what a lot of young composers would have accomplished at that point. So he's working on all cylinders, I think, in this piece. Can either of you just talk about just a couple of moments in the piece that are especially either revelatory or just especially fun? Or, you know, I mean, Nathan, you have a lot to do. You have at least three different moods to attain, you know. There's the circus, there's the beautiful singer, and then there's the military. I mean, at least in those ways.
No, and it's great to be able to try to emulate each one of those images that you just referenced. The second movement, the lyric solo, is just so beautiful, and just trying to bring as much emotion to that as possible. That's one that is normally asked for on auditions, and just, you know, being able to evoke as much emotion as I possibly can into that. And all while hitting all the right notes. It's very challenging to go down like the very delicate low register, and then it expands to the high register as well. So it's very, what I was talking about flexibility earlier in about military bands and all that. Like, you have to be very flexible to get all over the range of the horn. But then you have the military.
Does it help or hurt with the mute? Does it help or hurt with the mute to play the extremes, you know, going low and then having to do leaps? And
if you have a good mute, it's pretty much the same as. It's actually a little bit easier with the mute to play a little bit fuller, because it's marked at such a soft dynamic. To continue the airflow, you're able to play just a little bit louder with the mute in to get those notes to be able to flow a little bit easier. And it's really all about air. I won't go to the technical parts of that, but just with the mute, you are able to play just a touch louder so that it passes through to all of the people who are going to be in the audience. So unfortunately not for this program, but yeah, you're just able to play just a touch louder so that it speaks a little bit easier. So.
And Sarah, this is a 5-movement work, not a 4-movement work. I'm thinking of. It's concerto for orchestra. I'm sorry, we're doing a movement from a concerto for orchestra, which has 5.
Well, that's kind of the interesting.
This is 4 movements, which is different. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's variably referred to as in 3 movements, or 4, or actually 5. From time to time, I have seen it referred to as 5 movements. I think of it more really as 4. But when you ask, is there any particular moment that really stands out? It's very interesting because, of course, the standard piano concerto would have an allegro first movement, a slow movement, and then some sort of fast last movement. And these things all happen in this concerto. But there's a very, very beautiful transition that takes place at the end of this very sad waltz that serves as the second movement. And it's for the piano solo, and this is this is where the distinctions lie. You know, is that a separate movement or is it an introduction to the last movement? And the answer is both, of course, naturally. But that's the nicest moment, in a sense, for the pianist on the stage. It's almost as if, you know, all of this hullabaloo stops for a moment, and there's this kind of meditative solo reflection. It starts with a low note in the bass here, this low E flat, and then it has such an interesting kind of texture and sound. There's actually some elements of Bach going on there where the two hands imitate what each is doing. But it doesn't, whenever I hear this, you know, I'm thinking about one of these classical films, you know, and now the narrator looks right into the camera and says, I remember the time in old Mother Russia when Babushka came to tell us. There it is. But it's this kind of revelatory moment or solo moment for the soloist. And in that sense, I mean, I think of this piece particularly as some kind of very fantastic drama, in a sense. It is really a theater piece, in the sense that the trumpet player plays some sort of military character there who's having his own show. And then there's the Greek chorus in the background, which you're taking charge of. And then there's this pianist, here's the composer who puts himself into all of those proceedings. So it's like, here's the bad boy with his new concerto, and here's the Soviet military, and here's the Russian people in the background, and it's snowing, and it's December, and it's Leningrad, and you have arranged for the flakes to fall right during this particular.
No question. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You know, you could easily set it to a film, and in fact, it's the second piano concerto of Shostakovich is so fantastically portrayed in that Fantasia 2000 movie with that battle of toy soldiers. It's absolutely perfect. I mean, it's a lot of Shostakovich. You mentioned his experience of playing for silent films. And I hear a lot of his music as very cinematic. It really is absolutely made for films. And he did write film music as well, in addition to old symphonies and string quartets and the two piano concertos. So he's a man of great variety in what he could do.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're really looking forward to our collaboration with you both. And I thank you for taking the time to speak with us right now. And we look forward to seeing you in person, albeit with masks. Nathan, you far away. It's going to be an interesting experience to have you sort of playing from one of our theater boxes, so that
it'll be
we'll
fun.
Get the full range of your playing, but it will be an unusual presentation. Easy for the cameras to catch hold of you, and for our virtual audience to experience, but certainly a new way of performing for all of us, I think. Adventures in COVID land. But thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.